It was a pretty stereotypical chilly Canadian spring of 2015, and I was looking for a new hobby. School was out, work was slow, none of my sports were in season, and I needed something engaging and interesting to pass the time. Pretty soon it was brought to my attention that my friends had started watching anime recently. I wasn't really that interested and had only seen shows like Yu-Gi-Oh!, Pokemon, Beyblade, and Digimon as a young kid after school, but never really gave the medium much notice. My friends told me about this anime called Attack on Titan, that I should check out to see if I'd like it. I saw it, and I thought it was pretty badass, and decided to see if maybe there were any similar anime out there that would help me pass the time. Funnily enough, the second show I ever watched was Shiki, which was completely different from Attack on Titan, but very effective with communicating some pretty disturbing themes, and I really liked it. The third show I saw was Death Note, which was hugely enjoyable as well. So at this point, I had started to realize that anime was quite a bit more than Goku screaming for 5 episodes straight, and I was glad that I had started watching because I'd really found some cool stuff. But at the same time, I considered anime to be a bit of a short-term phase. I was burning through some good shows, but I was completely expecting to watch maybe a couple more, and then move on to some other hobby, leaving anime in the past. But then, I discovered Steins, the anime that completely changed my views on the medium, and probably changed my life. I like time travel stories, so I gave Steins a go. I found the opening episodes to be a bit strange and eccentric, but I really bought into the intrigue that the show established through its brilliant cinematography and ominous tone at times. Not to mention, the characters were all lovable and quirky. I just enjoyed spending my time in the scorching hot, cicada-filled afternoons in Akihabara with these characters. I couldn't really tell where the show was going, but I was having a great time with it and was projecting a very solid 7 or 8 out of 10. And then everything changed halfway through the series. Steins has a notoriously slower and more lighthearted opening half, and I'm sure that like many that watched the show, it was the last couple of minutes of episode 12, where the tone drastically shifts and the stakes are raised to the heavens, that I became hooked. Everyone touts the tone shift here as the moment where Steins becomes a masterpiece. But the truth is that the slower and lighter earlier episodes were completely essential for the weight and tension of the second half to be as palpable as it was. If the characters weren't established so well early on, then the high-octane, emotional rollercoaster of a second half would have felt shallow and dishonest. At this point in the story, I quickly realized how I had come to love these characters, and became instantly and literally hooked to the show. Steins captured every essence of my being. I finished episode 12 at around midnight, and proceeded to finish the rest of the series that night because I literally couldn't take myself away from it. I was transfixed in awe at Steins. I finished at around 5 AM and was emotionally drained, yet so happy to have experienced such a wonderful story by the end of it. So while the plot, higher tension, and raised stakes were definitely contributors to the show's greatness, these are all somewhat mechanical aspects of a show. What I mean by that is that these characteristics can only truly contribute to a subjective masterpiece if they're combined with characters and themes that appeal to the viewer on an emotional and conceptual level. And Steins meant so much to me because it was, and might still be, the most emotionally engaging thing I've ever seen. It hit all the right notes and resonated with me so deeply. I'm going to try and articulate some examples of this, but words will never do justice to all the little moments in this show that felt like they were written just for me. You're gonna have to forgive my pronunciation here, but let's get one thing straight. Steins works so well because of Okabe Rintaro. The plot is smart, the other characters are great, the visuals are stunning at times, and the music was masterful, but all of these elements are only as great as they are because they can be applied to the context of Okabe. I challenge you to try and think about any of these elements without them somehow relating to Okabe. This series is the absolute definition of character-driven, and the show did a brilliant job at establishing our protagonist. Right from the first episode, it's immediately established that we are in this man's head. There are very few times throughout the series where a scene happens and Okabe is not present, which just augments his importance. Steins established Okabe as a thoughtful but off-the-wall and eccentric guy, and one whose quirks may have been a bit strange and jarring at first, but who the vast majority of viewers were able to really warm to. But through Steins Gate's emotional roller coaster of a plot, we learn that Okabe's mad scientist persona is a mask. I had grown to assume that our protagonist was just an incredibly wacky and lighthearted person, as his truest essence of self. But while the mad scientist is a huge part of Okabe, that's all that it is, a part of a whole, a mask. Okabe admits this, but doesn't fully throw off the front until well into the story, and regardless of how prominent the Ho and Kiyoma character was, it was a facade. And the most interesting thing about this facade was realizing that this was a facade. Okabe is someone who longs to form bonds with others, but the fact is that he's just not good at expressing this. He's socially awkward, weird, and not easy to understand. This is more clear than ever throughout the first act of the show if you understand his past, but during my first watch, I was none the wiser. The tone shift not only changed how I viewed the show, but it changed how I viewed Okabe. Now obviously, a character in Okabe's situation, losing a loved one over and over again, is not going to be tossing out jokes, but I was really taken aback at how deadly serious and somber he was. I don't really know if there was another realistic way for him to act, but it was striking to me how the transpiring events just dragged him down further and further, until I really became amazed at how traumatized and grim he was. And it was all because of the juxtaposition. The contrast between Okabe's formerly over-the-top, joke-cracking self and this new Okabe was so brilliant because of how wrong it felt, given everything about the character that had been established previously. The tone felt so much darker, the stakes felt higher than they already were somehow, and my investment was so deep because of how attached I had become to this guy previously. And seeing him put through the ringer was really devastating at times. I talked about some of the profound horror of time travel in my review of Re:Zero, so I won't repeat myself. But Steins Gate did so well at communicating Okabe's desolation, loneliness, and pure agony, which all worked because of the first half of the show. And I should add that this effect is compounded in the visual novel, where Okabe finds himself more frantic and depressed than the anime communicates. At his heart, Okabe is not actually as aloof as you'd think. This may be a bit of an injustice and an oversimplification, but I think that he can be best summed up as a man who cares for and just wants the best for his friends. He is actually quite serious when it gets right down to it, in my opinion. And one could argue that this seriousness was a new part of Okabe's psyche that was formulated due to his trauma, but there are brilliant little moments throughout the first season that are noticeable on rewatch, where little bits of anxiety or seriousness crack through Ho and Kiyoma's mask, just for a second. And little touches like this really go a long way. Okabe actually started this persona as a method of getting Mayuri to snap out of her deep depression after the death of her grandmother, and kept it up out of his deep care for her until it became a bit more than just an act. This act became so ingrained in Okabe as the years went on that it actually became a part of him. This mad scientist slowly but surely turned into part of Okabe's character, part of his self. But the trauma of the events that unfold in Steins Gate reversed this development, and then broke this down, only for Okabe to learn to use this persona in a much more empowering and healthy way. It was a really interesting character arc. Of course, I love all the other characters and wished for their happiness as well, but due to the way we're put in the man's head so often, a lot of the investment I had in the show was in Okabe. I wanted this man to succeed, I wanted him to be happy, I didn't want him to suffer. And that's why the narrative worked so well for me. With this very, very strong emotional foundation for the series, so many meaningful moments that are tackled throughout, which are resonant even dependent of context, had even more weight and made me reflect, think, and feel to an extent that I really hadn't experienced before. It's very interesting. The narrative fooled me into thinking that I didn't care that much about these lovable characters, as much as I actually did, simply because I honestly couldn't foresee that things would get so grim. And once I realized how precious this story was to me, I was able to connect so deeply with it, and several moments throughout spoke to me on an intimate level. You really can't talk about Steins Gate for too long without mentioning Makise Kurisu. While the story doesn't rest on her shoulders as it does with Okabe, it would not have worked nearly as well without her. I suppose that you could classify Kurisu as a classic tsundere, and I wouldn't really argue with that. But Kurisu represents my absolute favorite ever integration of a tsundere character archetype in a narrative. In the first half of the show, she's quite similar to Okabe in that she puts up a front and a pseudo-mask. Her true feelings slip through a bit more than Okabe, but our impression of her is more or less dominated by cute moments, scenes where she shows her spunk, and sprinkled with some rather tender scenes and touching monologues. She was a good character in the first half, but in the second half, she becomes and feels like much more. Part of the tragedy of Okabe's desolation is that for a time, he had no one to help him. Mayuri and Daru had their hearts in the right place and tried at times, but they really couldn't function as someone that Okabe could lean on. The worst part about this is that we were there on the outside. We were the onlookers unable to do anything. I found myself so sad for Okabe's situation that I couldn't help but internalize and almost put myself in his shoes, crying out for someone to please help this poor man. And Kurisu does. There's an innate understanding that she has with Okabe that's completely natural. She can tell when he's not right, and Mayuri can do this as well, but Kurisu's superior knowledge of time travel and science meant that she could immediately apply that understanding over and over again through every world line to help Okabe. And because of how character-driven this story is, and how deeply associated with Okabe we are at the apex of his suffering, Kurisu's tenderness and care endears her so much more to the audience than it would have in a story with a different narrative structure. She adds a light that pierces through the darkness, and everything about her, Okabe, and the story accentuates that. I'm going to leave this point here, but I'll just end on this. For a time, Kurisu was the fictional character that I had felt most attached to by far in my life. And this is purely due to how her traits as a loving and good human being feel like so much more when put into the context of this personal narrative. There were also little segments of the story throughout that each could have had their own 25-episode anime. Mr. Braun had a very interesting subplot to him. Ruka's struggle for self-acceptance was beautifully executed, though a bit underdeveloped, and Moeka, despite being my least favorite character, had some themes in her character arc that were really quite striking. Daru and Suzuha, who happens to be my second favorite character in the show, had a really lovely moment in realizing that they were father and daughter as well. And, well, Suzuha's letter to Okabe and his friends about her sheer anguish at her failure to change the future and her resulting suicide was one of the most heart-wrenching things I've ever experienced, driving home the message of living each day to the fullest and not living with regret in a roundabout way. There was also just a little line said by Mayuri that resonated with me as much as anything else, where she laments at the sadness that comes with the pure concept of lost memories and not being able to recall meaningful events. And I always come back to this line when I think about how well Steins nailed the topic of how valuable your memories truly are. At the end of it all, a lot of these moments left me feeling like the message of the show was to communicate that there is so much to a person. There is so much more to a person than you might see on the surface. Everyone is fighting their own personal battles, and to assume otherwise is to be incredibly narrow-minded and foolish. Okabe, Kurisu, Suzuha, Ruka, Ferris, Mr. Braun. Throughout Steins Gate, we're introduced to plenty of people who live life wearing a metaphorical mask, hiding their true feelings and personal issues behind a front. And I assumed during the first half of the show that these people were shallow and more or less what they seemed, with a couple of exceptions. But at the end of my amazing watch of this gorgeous series, I was absolutely inspired to give more thought to people. Who could have ever thought that Mr. Braun was living in constant fear of his sweet daughter's life given the first episodes? Who could have known that Ferris lived most of her life agonizingly missing her father, and that she had the resolve and pure character to turn away from her greatest desire to help her friends? I know that this isn't the most unique message, but it's effective, simple, and so important. I'm not saying that this is absolutely the main theme of Steins Gate, and like I've said, there are so many things to take away from its ideas. Steins Gate had quite a few other characteristics that have all had an impact on me in varying degrees. Like how inspiring the against the odds nature of Okabe's character arc was, how well the cicadas were implemented, and how the show organically taught me about otaku culture. But I don't want to be editing this video for a year. I'll just say that Steins Gate taught me so many important things, and communicated them to me emotionally and in the most effective way possible, and I'll leave it at that. Steins Gate had made me feel things that I had never ever felt before. I felt joy, horror, sorrow, pain. I felt more invested in Okabe's struggles than I had ever been in any other fictional work. It was quite simply the most emotionally connected I had ever been with a show, and it taught me so much about life. At that time, Steins Gate was far and away my favorite story ever. In reflecting on all of this immediately after the show for the first time, I became truly aware of what anime as a medium could achieve. And I thought to myself, I've only seen 4 anime, and one of them has literally changed my life. I can't stop watching here, or I'd be depriving myself of some brilliant stories, fascinating themes, great characters, and possibly some more self-discovery. And so I continued with anime. I watched Code Geass next, and then Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood, and then Fate Zero, and it all snowballed. I haven't looked back since. Anime has been, and remains a huge part of my life, and I definitely have Steins Gate to thank for that. I don't really know if Steins Gate is still my favorite anime of all time. My top favorites tend to switch around in order depending on my mood or the day, so it's pretty hard for me to nail down one as a definite number 1. But what I do know about Steins Gate is that at the time I watched it, it had the biggest impact on me that I had ever experienced from any work of fiction. Maybe none of you have had the same experience that I had with Steins Gate. In fact, I'd be surprised if you did. But I'm sure that from what little I've seen about the show in my comments, it was an anime that deeply touched a lot of you as well. I feel like a lot of people have this one anime, the one that they saw early on that is a true masterpiece in their eyes, and that opened up a world of possibilities to them and helped them to get ingrained in the medium. An anime that connects to you on an emotional level that you never even thought was possible. It was Steins Gate for me, but I'm curious to see which anime it was for some of you. Anyway, this is a much more personal video than some of my other ones, but I felt like there was no more appropriate of a way to talk about this beautiful show than simply trying my best to communicate why it means so much to me in a more stream of consciousness way. And let's be honest, any attempt at objective and unbiased analysis would turn into gushing eventually. This probably isn't the end of Steins Gate content on this channel, but I don't know if you guys would want to see more, so let me know in the comments. Also, I'd love it if you guys shared your experiences with this story, whether it be your favorite moment, your favorite character, any problems you had, or anything else really. Thanks for checking out the video as always, and I'll see you guys later.